All right, hello everyone. This is Mark Delacroce back in the hosting seat again. I've been out adventuring across the globe, the country, to warmer climes than my poor frigid Indianapolis, which is currently both frozen and snowed in. But I am back here again, and I will show you basically. I'm gonna click the right button. I've got all of these cool buttons here, and one of them is the right one. That's the right one. Cool. Um, and I've got to make sure I click the right ones to get all the cool stuff. And I am here today talking to Josh Simons about his awesome, basically dynamic storytelling superhero RPG, Paragons. All right. We want to basically go ahead and basically, so Josh, I will let you introduce Paragons. Basically, tell us a little bit about the system and yourself, and basically what makes it interesting and cool.
Of course, yeah. So Paragons is inspired by superhero cartoons, and a lot of it is the stuff that I watched growing up. It's Teen Titans, it's Batman the animated series, but also more recently, I've enjoyed watching anime like My Hero Academia, the recent X-Men '97 show, and things like Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. All that stuff kind of was huge inspiration. It is a very much like narrative driven. I like to use the word cinematic. Um, Fast-paced superhero RPG. It uses D6 dice pools because it's really easy to roll, figure out how many successes you got, and keep the story moving. Yeah, it's dynamic. It's fast-paced, and I think it's a lot of fun.
Awesome. Let's basically kind of start digging into it in terms of basically your inspiration. Basically, are those series. Basically, there's a lot. Basically, superhero is an amazing genre. It's got such breadth and things like that. In terms of basically, you've got everything from like basically your dark and gritty. You've got Invincible. You've got stuff. Basically,
Yeah.
you've got basically even more darker. You've got even in Batman, just Batman alone. You've got various basically Batman 66 all the way to basically Batman Returns, basically the Dark Knight, and all of those.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Basically all those things. So where do you basically is this basically would you say that Paragons is to basically focusing in more end of it, or is it an open-ended system where you're like, hey, if you want to tell a dark and gritty system, you could do that. If you want to tell a lighthearted, basically this will do that as well.
Yeah, great question. So I tend to approach game design and system design as thinking about providing a toolkit. And so Paragons doesn't dictate the rating, right? The TV rating. If you want to use like PG, G, R, all that kind of stuff. It doesn't dictate necessarily the content of the game. That's a thing that you can adjudicate at your table, and that's part of our like little session zero blurb. Is we recommend having a conversation with your players and figure out what the tones and themes that you want to explore are. I think personally, as a tabletop gamer, I tend to sit in like the PG-13 range. I like getting into some of the topics and themes that can be heavier, but I'm not the kind of GM who's going to describe gore to the excess. That isn't my personal favorite uh, way to play a game, but that doesn't mean that you couldn't do that. I did watch a lot of the Invincible series during periods of my design process for Invincible or for Paragons, and so Invincible was certainly an inspiration in a couple of ways. One of the scenarios that I wrote for the starter kit, which is in development and we're going to be crowdfunding for later this year, is actually very heavily inspired by one of the early encounters that Invincible deals with the aliens who come from the alternate dimension, but then have to go back because the time stream is moving too fast in this world, and so then they age way too fast, and they have to go back and figure out a way to fix it, and then they come back. And I wrote it scenario loosely inspired by that, because I thought it was a fun idea that someone coming in from another dimension wouldn't understand like the nature of things here, and would encounter some kind of technical issue that halted their invasion. I thought it was funny. But yeah, from a very high level, you can do anything with it. I tend to do PG-13, but you could go, G-rated and play with kids, or you could go, R or NC-17 rated and play with adults who really want a series that leans into, the vibes of The Boys or Invincible or something like that.
Yeah, basically, I really appreciate you mentioning basically the safety in the session zero. That's always important. I always encourage basically GMs, whether it's a first, but especially if you're moving into a genre like this that has such breadth, or if you're doing something like sci-fi, which has horror and also has basically utopia inside of it. Make sure that you basically figure out what your group is looking for. And I do appreciate it. You've kind of broken it down, and you're like, hey, here are some categories you can talk about with your basically you could talk about with your group, and you could be like that G to NC-17 basically, or just not at all rating is a great way of basically breaking it down. Basically, when you talk to your group and be like, hey, let's make sure that we all understand basically what we're getting into, what we're looking at, and basically no one is unpleasantly surprised in the middle of if someone shows up expecting Batman 66 and gets hit with vivid descriptions of gore or assault or anything like that basically in the middle of a session, no one's going to have fun after that.
Yeah. And since we used the comparison very early on of a TV series, it really made sense for us to keep referring back to that same sort of like vocabulary that people have from watching movies and watching television, and so we thought it was a really nice tie-in to specifically compare to those movie ratings. Because everyone understands them, right? Yeah, that's not a thing that we have to explain. And so I don't have to explain what safety tools are. I can just say, do you want your game to feel more like a G-rated game or more like an R-rated game? Talk about that at the table, and leave it at that.
Yeah, basically, and also basically something else, basically kind of keeping on that session zero thing, something else which is always interesting is when people sit down and they're like, okay, we're playing a superhero game, and obviously basically people can have, again, it's a wide genre, so basically in terms of power level and in terms of basically in terms of dynamics of relationships and things like that, do you feel that Paragons pushes more towards basically it's flexible in terms of it's like, hey, if you want to play a street level basically this, you could do that. You could do Superman, it can do basically Nightwing, in terms of basically kind of a range of different power levels? Or do you feel like, okay, this has more of a home of being a little bit more, this is more metahuman, it's more X-Men, it's more people have powers that basically tend to be fairly powerful, it's more My Hero Academia, less vigilantes, to use another example?
Yeah, hey, it's a good example. I've been enjoying the Vigilante series. I would say that I think Paragon's like the sweet spot where it feels right is in that like street level to city level hero range. It's not that you couldn't go to higher power levels. We have canonically in the world a character named Paragon who is our Superman, and he's not from another planet. He's a dude from Georgia. But we have tried to, I think, sidestep the, how do you make Batman and Superman in the same universe not feel super lopsided by focusing on certain types of stories. And obviously it's an RPG, so much of it is going to be team-based. Because that's just the nature of the games we play. There's optional rules for solo play, and so you could totally do something like that, and that would be a great scenario to play with, power scaling and things like that. But at least as I approach the game during writing it, I feel like the sort of street level to city level threats are where Paragon shines the brightest. The dice mechanics, I think, are really what I like about them, and they're heavily inspired by the Year Zero engine, for the record. because simply rolling dice looking for successes, more successes means you do more damage, more successes means that, you know, the result that you want to have happens, and more successfully with additional successes. um, I think makes it very easy to lean into the sort of fluid, dynamic narrative style that you would expect from a superhero show or movie. And so definitely tends to lean. I don't love the term rules light when comparing it, you know, when talking about Paragons, because I think there is a lot of depth in terms of how you use the rules. There's just not, you know, pages and pages and pages of stuff that you have to memorize in order to effectively play the game. And so we use a powerful, like, core system that then repeats that same basic set of mechanics in various ways, and you use them in various ways in order to get all the different elements of play. If that's a helpful way of describing it, and I think gets to the answer that you're looking for there.
Yeah. Basically, it's basically a lot of basically there are basically it's always interesting when you sit down. You're like, okay, what are we gonna play? What's it gonna be like in terms of basically what type of characters are we creating? Because a lot of systems struggle with that. You end up with I've made this and it is ridiculously overpowered, and you're like, well, I wanted to play this, and you have a character who could do one thing okay,
Yep.
as opposed to I have a character who could do everything great. Basically, you have to balance both of those being at the same table. And so basically, if you come in with okay, here's the expectation for this world is you're all going to be playing as a team in basically at a street city level. You have a city, you have a team. Basically, that kind of leads into talk. Basically, you, not only is Paragons basically a rule system, we've also created a world to go with it that can kind of support that idea of team level and things like that. Basically, if you want to talk about basically the kind of the world you've created to support that, and the kind of here's the tools we're giving GMs to kind of play with to get them started.
Yeah, of course. So the world building for Paragons happened in a couple of stages, and I initially wrote up a couple of bullet points. I want something like this. I want something like this. I want something like this. And then I went and talked to Eugenio Vargas, who is one of the writers on Paragons, and whose work you might be familiar with from Rivals of Waterdeep and some other actual play streams, and has done a fair amount of publishing, particularly on the DMs Guild in the tabletop space over the last few years. And Eugenio is a phenomenal guy and a brilliant storyteller. And I said, hey man, I've got some ideas for what I want the general shape of the world to be, but I know that world building is something that you are better at than I am. Here's some ideas, here's some inspiration, go. And so he did a lot of that writing, and I think it turned out really, really strong. Particularly, what's included in the core rulebook is a single chapter. It's a couple of sample characters, it's a couple of organizations in the world, it's a couple of key locations. And for each of the things that we included in that chapter, he used the term story engines, which I really like. Every organization tells you what they're trying to do, what historically they've done, and gives you some ideas, right? It doesn't tell you what's happening necessarily, but it plants some seeds. They could be trying to accomplish this. They could be trying to accomplish this. This is a way that you could encounter them in your campaign. And so instead of saying, this character does X, Y, and Z, and it's like a profile that you're reading on a page, it's very much, here's what we know about them, here's what you may or may not know about them, and here's what the rumors say is happening in this location, or what this organization is up to. And so very much trying to plant seeds for GMs to take and run with. I like that approach because it is less descriptive of what's happening in the world and more, again, approaching a game like a toolbox and a set of tools. We're saying, hey, GM, here's some things that you can play with. Here's some ideas. Take it and run with it and make it yours at the end of the day. And in particular, I like how we structured that component for um, the locations, where we specifically include, right, tidbits that are like, here's what the rumors say, and then you get to decide as the GM whether or not that's real. The basic premise of the world is that superheroes have always existed. There have always been people with unique abilities, as far back as you can think in history. In mythology, there's, of course, like Hercules and Achilles and all of those classic heroes. We reference Kintaro from Japanese mythology. We reference Gilgamesh from Middle Eastern mythology. Um, and of course, even things like, Solomon's wisdom, or things from like a Judeo-Christian tradition. Those are all real stories. That's the premise of Paragons. Those are all real stories. Those things really happened. Those people really had those powers. And to this day, there continue to be a small number of people with abilities. It just happens. Every generation, there's 100 or so people that have powers. And because there's so few of them, and because they are so uniquely gifted, they have this, outsized ability to impact the world around them and the course of history. And so, one of the key things that I said to Eugenio when I was like, hey, let's come up with this world, is I said, I don't want to have to go rewrite, an entire alternate history of the world. I want to say the world is as it is today. History has happened. We are familiar with New York City. We know Chicago. We know London and Paris and Tokyo and Beijing and all these different places. Let people play in the places that they know, right? Right. If you want to set your superhero story in Orlando, Florida, or Indianapolis, or wherever else, right? Do that. Use the real world locations that we all know and love. The key thing is that there are heroes and there's villains, and those heroes have to save the day and carry this weight of responsibility, because they are the only people who can do so.
Yeah, basically, it's basically one of the things I love about the superhero genre is the fact that, because a lot of the time it's set in modern time periods and things like that, there's a lot of ability to use real world locations, real world resources, and things like that. Like, you need a fight location, pull up Google Maps, look for a park, look for look for, you need a street map, you need a coffee shop. You're like, cool, there's this and this and this and this, and all of that is there. And basically you as the designer basically have been like, hey, let's throw some interesting elements in there. And basically, I love the fact that you're like, there's only 100 of you, so you're going to have an impact on the world. You're going to do something interesting with these characters, and so it sets that tone right away of, hey, you are somebody interesting, someone relevant in this world. Make a difference. Basically, we provided these bits and pieces, and basically, I like the fact that basically kind of Blades in the Dark is another great example of world building, that kind of like what you've done here, in terms of, here's a bunch of organizations that we're going to give you a little bit of information on, that gives you some conflicts and some direction and some, basically, you don't have to use all of them. You could use none of them if you want, but they're there to give you those little, like the story engines that you're talking about, basically to give you a start, give you a direction, give your players something to run into, that they can be like, oh, that's that, or that's that, or they've got this thing, and they've got this goals and things like that, and there's something for your players to interact with that you don't have to, as a GM, whole cloth create for yourself every time you want to interact with this. But at the same time, you're not stuck in a box going, oh, okay, my players can only, basically, they have to be registered government agents with this exact organization, they have to be based out of this thing, and they have to do these things. There's a lot of, basically, it sounds like there's a lot of cool leeway and basically things like that for, in terms of, hey, what do I basically how does that work? And it also sounds like, from basically the way you've got your system set up, it doesn't have to be a, okay, this basically we're going to go smash action figures together, and then the next session we're going to smash action figures together again. You've given yourself, the world where you have this outside influence, but it doesn't have to be violent. And basically, you've got the systems built in there for, hey, let's have some social, let's have some other, basically some team building interactions and things like that. You want to talk about basically those, because I think that's a really interesting, it's a part that superhero games oftentimes kind of just leave out, because a lot of times they're like, you just want to smash action figures together, here are the
Yeah.
systems that smash action figures together, stop asking us about diplomacy.
Yeah. Well, and hey, look,
There's
every
nothing
now
wrong
and
with
then
smashing
I
action
I
figures
want a game that is
together.
just fight, 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 fight all the time, right? There are times where that is what you want. But I thought in particular for something that is very much inspired by superhero cartoons and movies, some of the most impactful pieces of superhero media aren't really about using powers in combat. Like that there's a veneer of superhero action scenes and things like that. But like what makes the Teen Titans so cool and fun to watch, at least for me growing up watching the show, was the relationships between the people on the team and how do they relate to one another? What do those relationships look like? The same thing I think can be said for the X-Men, right? Like the key appeal there isn't that you've got superheroes, it's that you've got superheroes who are set in this school setting, and there's a level of mentorship and learning and training, and also they're a group that is trying to like protect the students from the outside world who potentially wish harm on them, and so I think superhero stories are so good at um, making commentary about society, about the real world. And this is a little bit tangential, but I think superhero stories have the ability to um, parody things that we see in the real world very well. They have the ability to comment and poke fun at power systems and authority figures, and are I think ultimately a critique of power and how we use power in society. And so there's so much that you can do with superhero stories. Getting back to the narrative components, we've got mechanics for dealing with reputation. I think a big part of being a hero, being in the public eye, that I really like the way that they approach this in the My Hero Academia universe, uh, is you are as a hero kind of a celebrity, even if not like in the traditional sense. That there is responsibility that you carry simply by the nature of being in the public eye, and that reputation is important. How people view you is important. And in the My Hero universe, you're getting ranked, and the higher rated you are, the more deals you get, and things like that. And the popularity translates into money and better jobs and things like that. In the Paragons universe, it's much more, I think, grounded on, does the media trust you when you say something after taking down a bad guy? When you walk into a room, are people afraid of you, or are they excited to see you? Are there influencers who stop you on the street to be like, "Hey, tell me about this villain you just fought," and get in your face? How do you respond to that? Um, and I think that idea of playing with responsibility, of being in the public eye, of navigating that, is something that I feel like a lot of superhero stories kind of miss. Right, when the superhero is done, they've got their secret identity. They go home. They don't, you don't deal with their public persona versus, private persona a lot. Spider-Man being a good example of a hero that does actually, dig into that, or instances with like Superman and Clark Kent, Batman and Bruce Wayne. Right, you see bits and pieces of it, but I think it's a thing that you could certainly explore more. I mean, I was really excited to explore in a role playing game. There's training sequences and montage scenes where you can work on your powers and improve your abilities without leveling up, which I think is a key part of like superhero media, right? We see the heroes doing their training montage, or unlocking some new ability, especially in like anime, right? They're pushed to the limits, and then suddenly, right, they unlock this new use for their powers. They've never found it before, and it's cool. And you get this really sick sequence as they're using their new abilities for the first time. And I thought, how do I capture that with a game mechanic? Let's add training as an option and allow people to improve their abilities in that way. We have investigation mechanics that I think are really about, and a lot of the inspiration behind the investigation mechanics come from like the Detective Batman comics, right? Where it's less about Batman's ability to fight, and it's more about his ability to piece together clues and figure out what's happening and track down the villains. And then, sure, he gets in the fight and he beats him up, and Batman does Batman things. But it's about following the clues and putting together the pieces of the puzzle to figure out what villain is behind this or what organization is behind this. And then you go and you have your superhero fight scene, and it's great and it's fun and it's cinematic, and you punch the bad guys. So we've got all kinds of stuff like that. We've got mechanics for, team building and character interactions. And again, like I keep saying, I think about it as a toolbox. And so we wrote out mechanics for scenes that we thought warranted, having a mechanical way to do this in game, a mechanical way to have a conversation with a teammate that encourages them and gives them, a small circumstance bonus going into the next session. But you also can do whatever you want, right? And that's the thing that I think ultimately I keep coming back to with RPG design is everything that's in the rule book is there for the GM to use or not use. And so, one GM might look at all those rules that I wrote for social scenes and say, I don't want any of that. I want to just go take the action figures and smash them together a bunch. And that's great. You can do that. But the next GM might say, hey, I really want to dig into the social dynamics and talk about, responsibility and how do you balance trying to do the right thing versus also knowing that you need to step in and take action, and it needs to be decisive to save the day, even if it's not necessarily the right action and people get hurt in the process. How do you navigate those things? And one of I realize I've been talking a lot, and I'm going to hit one more tiny little rabbit trail and then circle back.
You're fine.
Some of my most memorable experiences as a player in tabletop role-playing games is when the GM gives us an impossible choice, and you have to choose between saving Group A and letting Group B, be in harm's way and get hurt, or go save Group B and let Group A be in harm's way and get hurt. And try as you might, right? You can try to be in both places. You can try to split the party and help both groups of people. It forces you to make a difficult decision. And it forces you into a scenario where you cannot possibly save the day for everybody. And I think those are also, like, from the player perspective, you're like, oh man, I want to save the day. I want to help everybody. But from a narrative perspective, I think that is the most interesting choice that you could be in gameplay territory, because it's so reflective of the real world, right? We can't always do the right thing 100% of the time. We have to make tough choices, and they're not always going to be the right choice. But you still have to move forward, and you can't let analysis paralysis keep you from saving one of the two groups. And so ultimately, I think we've tried to equip the GM with all these tools so that you can tell those stories that are going to be memorable, that are going to leave a lasting emotional impact on the players, because it was a story that meant something.
Yeah, basically that's always great. Basically as a GM and as a player, there's always, but there are times where you've got a really cool situation, something is going on, and you want the GM to be able to have a way of dealing with, basically putting the players into interesting situations and then dealing with what happens out of it mechanically and things like that. Being able to be like, oh, okay, here's a system in place to deal with this. We've gone from basically smashing city blocks to a tense situation where we're trying to get the information over, basically get the information, interrogate this villain. How far is too far? Basically how do we negotiate with this group to basically to get something that basically helps both sides, and basically helps everyone. And being able to have mechanically systems that can do both means that as a GM, I don't have to stop the session and invent something on the fly that will feel good or feel consistent with how the rest of the systems work, or basically rejigger stats and things like that to get them to all to work out. It's good to have that option there and basically in my toolkit so I can keep playing, so that I can keep the group flowing. So I basically, it doesn't force me to. No one is going to kick down your door in the history of role playing. No one has ever kicked down the door and been like, that's a homebrew rule. How dare you? You're banned from using my system. Basically, like maybe a tournament at a D&D in the D&D at Gen Con. Maybe someone is good, then you're a stickler. But that's not a role playing game. That's a tournament. You have made it into more of a board game with slightly more basically room for rules adjustment. But when you're playing at home with your friends, basically the game is what you're playing. And it's always important to be like, hey, yes, you can choose to do what you want, but do you want, basically, if you want some help, if you want some systems that work well with the other systems I've created with the stats that I've given you, here's my suggestion for them. Basically, it's great to have all those tools in the toolbox. You're not stuck going, sure, let me think about how that, basically, let me stop everything cold to do that. It's great to be able to be like, hey, here's a set of tools you can use. Here's a situation you can use them in. Here are the mechanics and things like that, and how all those work. Do you care? I want to get stronger. Well, okay, cool. We've got a level up system. Well, I don't want to go all the way that way. I just want to make this one thing more cool. Oh, cool. We can do. Here's the mechanics for a training montage, and it's great that you have those in there, so that you can basically the GM can be like, we've got something for that. I can encourage my players to take advantage of it. My players know it's in there, it's in the rules, and so it can push them in a right, basically help push them and let me do the cool things like building that really interesting situation scenario where they're like, you have to make a choice. And the players be like, okay, mechanically we understand what we've got. Let's engage with it and be able to move from there. And it's always great. Basically, in terms of basically the mechanics can a lot of times can make or break a game like that where you're like, okay, I want to engage with this, but the mechanics are holding me back. They don't let me do it, or they don't feel like they fit what I've been given and things like that. And so basically your D6 system is an interesting balance. It's not aberrant as another one system I've used a lot of, where it's like, here are 600 D10s and you're going to chuck all of them at a situation and then you're going to sit there and count them forever. And it's not, okay, cool, you've got one die. Here you go. Yeah. The D20 type situation or things like that, where it's like you get one die and it's a make or break off that one die. Basically, you want to talk a little bit. Basically, you have an interesting, like the D6 and the failures that you've got off of that. Basically, what mechanically inspired you to use that for this superhero type system?
Yeah, of course. I think I said earlier, it's very heavily inspired by the Year Zero engine. And of course, there's other, similar inspirations. I think that the World of Darkness dice system gives you a lot of flexibility. You can always figure out what you need to roll by looking at what you're trying to accomplish and adding some stats. And so I've tried to emulate that same sort of approach in terms of building dice pools. The other thing that I really like about dice pools and counting successes instead of having numbers and adding this and subtracting that and multiplying this other thing is that it's a very clear delineation of how much more powerful something is, right? If you get one success, you've done the thing that you wanted to do. If you get two successes, it's twice as good. 3, 4, 5, etc. It's very easy to scale that from an indie film budget to Michael Bay, lens flare, huge explosions, right? Like we have a reference point for that with multiple successes. But yeah, so the dice system, right? You roll d6s. Your stats give you a number of d6s. You have abilities that add d6s to your dice pool. And so if my superhero abilities are that I can fly and that I can control fire, and I'm flying while I'm doing something, then I can add dice because I'm using my flying ability. Or if I'm trying to use my fire powers, I can add dice from that. And so there's rules about how you handle that, and all that stuff. You'll usually get a handful of dice from abilities, and then if you've got gear that's useful, that's helpful for what you're trying to do, you can add dice from gear. And then GMs also have the ability to give a circumstance bonus or a circumstance penalty. If you are surprising someone, you get a bonus. Perhaps the GM will say, "Yeah, you surprised him. You get to add an additional die to your dice pool. Instead of rolling 9 dice, you're rolling 10 dice. It feels good. You get the tactile sensation of rolling a big fistful of dice." And it's very easy to say, "Oh, well, you've got 2 or 3 degrees of things that are benefiting you, so you can add 2 or 3 dice," and that's nice. So you roll dice, and on a die, a 5 is a single success, and a 6 gives you 2 successes. It's a crit. So statistically, 1/3 of possible results give you a success, and so mathematically, it works out that somewhere around 40% of the time you'll get a success for dice that you roll. In terms of the way that the math works with 2 successes on a larger dice pool. You could get a 6 on one die and then roll nothing on everything else, and it works out to about 40%, give or take. There's some math there. I did all the math when I was designing the game. Trying to relay that without getting into equations is a little tricky.
Yep.
Ballpark 40%.
The mathematics of role-playing games is always fascinating, but yes.
That's a whole separate conversation, and honestly, we need to get a PhD in here to really explain it well. And that's not me, for the record. So right, you've got your dice. More dice gives you more chances at success. A 5 is a single success. A 6 is 2 successes. If you fail, if you don't get any successes, you can spend cool points, which is a mechanic that your character has that allows you to succeed. And you get an auto success when you spend a cool point. And so that's a mechanic that it's a stat that only the characters have that sets them apart from NPCs in the world, and is the thing that makes you feel like a hero half the time. If you fail, you can choose not to fail. You can spend a cool point, and as long as you have cool points, you can choose not to fail. You could also roll really well and spend cool points to add even more successes, so that way you absolutely land the knockout punch that you're trying to land. But if you do fail, the result isn't simply that nothing happens. I believe in failing forward. Something happens. There's a consequence to attempting this thing and failing, and that moves the story forward in a new and interesting direction, right? If you're trying to sneak into, the supervillain's base and you roll no successes, okay, the guards or the security system knows you're there. You no longer have the element of surprise. This changes things, and it puts you in a situation where you now need to come up with a new plan for how to move forward. And I think it makes for a really interesting narrative. And it's the kind of thing that we'd see in, cartoons all the time.
Yeah, basically, failing forward is a really important thing, and I always appreciate when systems include that as opposed to, basically, and most of the time, basically, when you're doing a more storytelling system, it makes more sense. It makes things more interesting. It's not just, okay, roll again. You didn't get through the door, roll again. Okay, you didn't cut through the lock, roll again.
Yeah.
And you end up with players it's like, if you're going to have players just keep rolling, just have them succeed, because the players, unless your players are really want to show off their shiny max rocks and they just really love rolling dice, that's not what they're there for. They're there to tell a story. They're there to have interesting consequences. They're there to fail so that their successes are more interesting. Basically, I really appreciate that when you're like, oh yeah, basically, we have failures, we have cool points, which is a great way of being like, the dice seem to hate you, let's mitigate that a little bit so you can do it when something is really important to you or your character, you can get it done in a way that makes it, that feels like, basically feels like landing that knockout punch, basically that basically is satisfying to your character, to your story. Great. But if missing is what basically a lot of times people are like, oh, I missed, but something basically if I didn't really miss, I still hit them, but I slipped and now I'm in a vulnerable position, and he wipes blood away from his basically from his cut lips and laughs, and now is going to basically make the attempt, and it's up to the rest of the team to step in. Basically those are great moments. Those are what we grew up watching the cartoon, basically seeing in the cartoons. And so it's always great having those kind of systems. And so I guess the next question, the follow-up question is how do the superhero powers kind of interact with that system? In terms of basically when you're creating, I guess it's going through character creation would be a great way of basically just kind of looking at it as a whole. Basically, how does that work into when you're building a character out? What does that basically in terms of, hey, I'm good at this, I'm bad at this? Because again, that balance goes all the way back to character creation. If everyone, you're like, hey, I want to roll up a D&D character and I want all 18s and all my stats because I want to be super powerful. Well, no, it's more interesting when you have characters who have high strength, basically high strength but low constitution. Well, what does that mean? Like the wizard who's just barely holding on and is coughing blood but can cast spells to destroy the universe is a much more interesting character than Mr. generically averagely, basically above averagely good at everything guy.
Yeah. There's a couple components to character creation, and stats are a big part of it. In terms of physical stats, we've got physique and finesse and stamina. And physique is like general, athletic ability, speed, strength, all that stuff. Finesse is really about like fine motor skills and how sneaky and stealthy you are, and stamina is about like durability and resilience. And then there's the mental stats, which is acuity and presence. And acuity is really about like problem solving abilities and general like knowledge retention, whereas presence is more like understanding your surroundings and being able to interact with things. And the reason I explain this is abilities often are tied to a specific fighting style, right? And we think about this very broadly, right? If you've got super strength, you're going to get up close and punch people. If you've got super speed, you may not necessarily want to be getting close to punching people, but you do need to get close to hit them, right? Mm-hmm. To shoulder check them or punch them as you drive by at 100 miles an hour. But there are abilities like telekinesis or, telepathy or controlling the elements that are more like mental abilities. And so from a very high level, when you use abilities and there's examples of what abilities can be in the rule book, but we also say, hey, if you want to do something very specific that isn't well represented here, take one of the things that exists here and modify it to do what you want to do with it. But we'll use, for example, there's an ability in the game called energy control, and you pick what type of energy it is, whether that's gravity or light or sound, right? Pick an energy, whatever you want it to be, and you can control it and manipulate it and use it as your weapon in a fight. You get a certain number of dice from your ability for using that energy that you choose to control, and we'll say it's light, for instance. So you are making an attack with your light control abilities. You are going to choose during character creation which of the mental abilities is which of the mental stats is the stat that you use to control that, and we can say it's presence, and then you will add your ability dice from that ability to your presence die, and that's how you make the roll. And so it is about assembling a big dice pool and giving yourself more chances at success. And so you're using your stats as a base, and then your abilities add dice. So I could try to hit you as just me, a regular person. I don't think my physical stats would be very good. You know, I'm not a boxer. I'm not a trained fighter in any way. I might have like 1 or 2 dice that I could roll if I was going to try to go and punch somebody. Um, a superhero would have a much higher stat if they had a very high, physique. Right? If super strength was their ability, they would have a much higher stat. Um, but they also have abilities that augment their attacks. And so if Paragon or Superman equivalent in the world of Paragons went to go make an attack, his physique stat is really high. It's like a 6 or a 7, I think. So he's rolling a lot more dice than I would be just by default. And then he has additional abilities that are added on top of the dice, right? He's got an ability called Heavy Hitter. That means that he adds more dice to his dice pool when he's punching people. And so the dice pool grows and grows and grows, and eventually you roll them all. And the more dice you have, the better chances you have of success. The more successes you get, the better the result of the thing that you're trying to do.
Yeah, basically, you also have, I think, basically, I believe you have archetypes and things like that, which are kind of a what type of build are you looking for in terms of, hey, basically, you have your stats, you can think, but you're like, okay, you want to be more of this, you want to be more of that. Basically, in terms of basically, because it's always interesting, basically, in terms of that, basically, that base system is a lot of superhero systems just kind of vaguely ignored, be like, okay, here are all the cool powers. So it's always good to be like, okay, no, here are the base stats are kind of basically are still important, but you're not basically, you don't have those base stats, and then you're not burdening them with a huge list of skills to go on top of that, and a huge list of powers to go on top of that. Basically, you want this to be much more like what's your average character creation time, would you say?
You know, if you really want to get into it, it might take 10 minutes. If you really want to like read all the options and weigh them all, I mean, if you're familiar with the game, if you know what they all are and don't have to read everything for the first time, very easily 10 minutes. If you've never read the rulebook before and you want to go through and read all your options, it could take a little bit longer than that. But I would say the most time-consuming part of character creation is coming up with your name and figuring out what your origin story and your motivation and your flaws are, because those are the components of the character that it isn't picking from a list of options. Here's where you start.
Basically 20 talking about basically needing a whole package of D6 dice. Basically, how many basically that's an interesting question. How many D6 would you say that you have that basically is the most that you would probably roll in a die pool? Because I talked about aberrant, because aberrant and exalted are kind of your, I use that as an example of your 15, 20 dice, and some of them are different, and you have to go through and you're counting like, okay, I need 5 or 6, and it's basically kind of a long process to when you're doing that. And this is obviously basically, what's the die pool size that you're probably looking at here?
Yeah. If you are playing max level characters, you could maybe need 20 dice at max level. When you start playing, particularly at level 1, probably 6 to 8 at most. 6 is pretty consistent. Once you hit levels 2 and 3, you can start to hit 10. Once you hit, like level 3 and 4, you might get to like 12 to 15, and then 6 is the highest level. There are some NPCs who are intended to be very powerful, and because it's one NPC against like a team of heroes, they have more dice. And so on the GM side, you could need probably 30 or so D6 for some NPCs, but we've introduced rules for not needing to roll dice, and you just take the number of dice in the dice pool, cut it in half, add 2, and that's how many successes you get. And that way you don't have to roll 30 dice 100 times over the course of a session. So we've got rules to simplify the dice rolling at very, very high levels for the GM. But I feel like for the players, part of the fun is rolling the dice,
Mhm. Um, and basically, in terms of basically, you talked about character leveling and things like that. What is the basically like 6 levels? Basically, we talked about training montages as it being a way of basically of players increasing their characters. What is character growth like? Like some systems, it's basically at the end of every 3 sessions, you're going to go up a level. Is this a basically is this a slower basically a slower growth where it's like, hey, to generally you'll kind of stay in the area where you're starting at, and basically if it's a really long and epic campaign, you might switch from middle tier, basically from low tier to middle tier. Or is it, hey, yeah, basically powers are generally coming, characters are generally going to see changes and growth in their characters basically every other session, every couple of sessions.
Yeah, it's very much driven by like the narrative. You know, you early on, I was trying to come up with a reliable like XP system for leveling, and it just didn't feel right.
Mm-hmm.
It felt very out of place for the rest of the mechanics, and so we kind of decided to say, hey. Uh, at the GM's discretion, when you finish a story arc, when you accomplish the thing that you've been trying to do for the last couple of sessions, they can let you level up if you have increased your power and increased your reputation. That's a great chance to do it. Um, uh, if you take down, the villain who's been terrorizing the city, I think it's a good reason for you to do something like that. But it's ultimately up to the GM's discretion as it fits for the narrative. Um, because you could, with the training mechanics, grow much, much stronger without ever leveling up. And so it's not like essential to power scaling to level up. It is optional in that sense. And so it's up to the GM when the level up happens, if at all.
Yeah. Yeah, basically, if it's basically a superhero's XP systems, it's always been kind of a, does it really make sense? Like, hey, we have to go beat up 5 more villains today so that we can reach level 2. Basically, so we're cruising the streets looking for thugs to beat up. And so it's always good to be like, okay, because some people want that. Basically, they want their characters to change quickly, just because number go up it's a psychology thing. People like it, but
It's
a lot of
satisfying.
times basically it's good to have, like, you can have number go up, but you don't necessarily need to be a whole level thing. And basically in terms of here's some great tips for basically when to do it, things like that.
Yeah.
Speaking of thugs and villains and basically things like that, you talked about a little briefly, like the NPC and things like that. What do you basically, I guess, what's in this, basically either in the base book, or basically like we talked, basically there's premades and things like that in terms of tips for the GMs to create villains? Because a lot of times that could also be the hard part for the superhero thing, is how do I create a challenge for these super powered characters? Because they're superpowers. They basically, like, if I send 5 guys with guns with them, maybe they'll just basically either some systems all the players die instantly, or they don't even notice them. And so figuring out
Yeah.
that balance is basically a lot of times what those GMs will turn to the books for.
Yeah, so we've got a whole chapter on running the game, and it starts with tips and tricks about pacing and building out episodes and how do you structure your story, and things like that. And then the second half of that chapter is called the GM Toolkit. At least that's what I called it in my first draft. We might have renamed it. And it's literally okay, your party is this level. Here's how you build a villain that mechanically is going to be challenging for them, obviously with the caveat that if you've got a team of all defensive superheroes and they're all really, really hard to hurt, and they have abilities that make it so they can resist a whole bunch of damage but don't actually deal a whole lot of damage themselves, you might need to bump up your firepower a little bit in order to get through that shielding. Or if you've got a party of superheroes that are all kind of glass cannons and they deal a lot of damage but they don't have a whole lot of health between them, maybe you need to bump up your villain's health a little bit so that way they can last a couple rounds in a fight. There's some variables there based off of what the hero's abilities are. We give kind of a baseline of here's about what a dice pool should look like. Here's about what their total stats should look like. And then we have some sample stat blocks in the back of the book too, as a good starting place for GMs to use. And then one of the things that I was really excited about, both with the first sort of sample episode that we published just after the Kickstarter, and that's available online. But also with the starter kit that we're working on, is providing more stat blocks, more things for GMs to steal and use in their own games. And so we've got 4 new scenarios in the starter kit that we're working on, and 2 of them have sort of like pitched battle type combats, where it's more about an accumulation of enemies as opposed to like dealing with individual villains. And then 2 of them are much more around individual villains and dealing with abilities that the other villain is throwing at them. And so we've got some things that GMs can steal, some fun ideas for interesting and challenging action scenes that are maybe not your kind of run-of-the-mill thing. And we're going to continue to publish more things that add to that GM toolkit, that give you stat blocks to steal from. Because I think ultimately that's after getting the actual rules out, it's just about publishing things that are useful for the GMs to keep running the game and make their own.
Yeah, basically, it's always great to basically never like they're like, oh, these system basically, do we really need to have examples of play? Do we need to have pre-made stuff? Those are always great because they give the GM something that, at least, even if they don't run it exactly, they give them something to be like, oh, this is the balance that they're looking for in this system. This is about what I should be throwing at, basically at this level of, basically it shows some thought has been put into, okay, this is how this balances out, things like that. But I guess we talked a little bit about Kickstarters and things like that. So what is, basically, in terms of Paragon Pro, basically there's what is available, like what is in the, basically in the main book. Basically that's out now, because that was basically crowdfunded, and you released that, and that's out, that's available. What's in that book for basically for GMs, basically, and then what else is out there currently for basically for Paragons?
Yeah. So the core book, right, it's got all the player-facing rules. It's got, like I mentioned, the GM chapter tools and tips and tricks. And in there is stuff to really quickly generate a supervillain. We got rollable tables, so if you don't have the time to sit down and figure it out yourself, you can roll up a name and roll up, their motive and their origin, and then slap a stat block together pretty quickly based off of that stuff. We've got stat blocks that you can steal from the back of the book. And that's meant very much to be a toolkit, like I've been saying. It's not like a comprehensive monster manual with hundreds of stat blocks. It's here's examples of what this looks like. Here's examples of what this looks like. If you want to go and write your own thing based off of that, you have all the tools and references to do it. But it's not like a collection of things. And so that's why it was really important to get some episodes out. So we've got the one sample episode called Space Metal that you can also buy on our website. And that is first scenario. It introduces you to 3 villains, and you can then continue to explore that story after the first episode. It's a one-shot. And it leaves things open-ended so that you can go then pursue those extra story pieces in subsequent sessions if you'd like to. And so then the starter kit is the continuation of that, and that's going to be crowdfunding this spring, and we'll be including 4 additional scenarios for that. There's beyond the like adventure content, there's nothing GM facing in the starter kit. It is meant to be a really easy onboarding point for players. But I've got plans to work and release some additional episodes for folks to use, and would like to eventually get like a campaign guide or setting guide put together, but I'm trying to piecemeal the things that are most helpful in the short term out now before getting a bigger book that takes time and money to make those things, and I'm not made of either of those, unfortunately.
Yeah, sadly, none of us are, sadly. But basically, it sounds like basically like you've got some like a great start. The book is basically got a lot of basically everything you need. It's got a little, it's got a, basically. I know that basically it's got a little adventure in there. I believe that the main book has it. I know the quick start guide, which is on your website, also
Mhm.
has that as well. If you're wanting just basically like a quick sample of like what the rules are like, what the basically what an example of play looks like, character sheets and things like that, which are always great to be able to have and print off. Um, and basically, the starter kit is great for basically because a lot of times when you're talking when you're sitting down with your group and you're like, hey, let's try this, and it's something they either they haven't done before, they haven't played before. Basically, you may want to sell it to your group with, hey, I've got everything we need right here. We don't have to sit down. We don't basically all this stuff is pre-made. We don't have to sit down and basically I don't have to do a lot of work. You don't have to do a lot of work, but it gives us a little taste and it helps us decide basically do we want to invest a little bit more time in this? Do you want to basically do you want to think about powers and basically what your characters are like and things like that? You don't have to for the first one. Here's everything you need. And so the starter kits are great for that. For hey, I want to sell this to my group. How do I do that without having to spend a lot of resources either on basically on my half as a GM and being like, oh, they didn't like it. Well, great. Or basically on their part as the players, where they're like, oh yeah, we spent a bunch of time and we just played one game of it. Basically, that doesn't feel like it's great. So starter kits are great for that. Quick start guides are great for that. And I'm always glad to see basically game designers and publishers coming out with those. Basically, a lot of the basically we've been kind of rotating this down there. Basically, you can see the book down there right now. We've been rotating through a lot of the art and cool stuff. And basically, I'm always appreciative. Basically, you've got some great art. Basically, in terms of basically, I love the fact that it's also got a lot of diversity and things like that, and accessibility. It's not just ye generic, basically standard guy and a guy in a superhero suit standing on basically standing there looking brutally out into a city that's full of scum and villainy.
Yeah.
It's got sunlight. It's got basically people different ethnicities, different abilities sets. So basically, I really do appreciate that. Basically, you've obviously put a little bit of time working with artists to get that vision of what the world looks like, and it actually looks like what a real world might look like, as opposed to just a hey, basically, this is just one or two things I've got here. Basically, I've got one idea, and I'm going to keep copying and paste it,
Yeah.
and it's going to look exactly like basically Marvel with some of the serial numbers falling off of it. It's going to look like DC with some of the serial numbers falling off of it. It's always great to see. Oh, it's got some really cool, interesting ideas and different changes, and gives you inspiration for doing other things.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, just to touch very quickly on art.
Yay.
We worked with an outstanding group of artists on the core book, and I've worked with some additional artists and some returning artists on the starter kit. And the thing that I tell every artist is, I want you to draw something that matches your experience and looks and feels like a thing that you would love to see in a book. And we can refine what that looks like and make sure that it fits the world of Paragons. Paragons is ultimately, I think, a very hopeful, positive outlook on the world. Is that there are heroes who will always step in to save the day, no matter what, and that hero could be you. And in this day and age, right, where sometimes it feels like it's hard to find bright spots to look at. I think it is even more important to have a world filled with heroes where it feels like everyone is sharing that responsibility to like step up and be a good citizen and help their neighbors and save the day. Because in the real world, we don't have the luxury of sitting back and waiting for a hero to show up and fix
Mm-hmm.
things. They don't exist here. And I also wanted that to be reflected in the world of Paragons, to say, hey, like, we're all in this thing. It's not just a handful of rich billionaires who can afford to build their super suits. It's everyday people who have powers and have heroes stories of their own.
Yeah, that's super important to be able to basically, and basically for the Raiders just came in. Basically thanks Raiders from Tales of Ignition for stopping by. Basically we're talking about Paragons, basically by Josh Simons. See here, who basically it's a really interesting, dynamic kind of superhero story system. Basically, it's a world about superheroes who are basically there's a small number of them, but they can make a big basically because of that they basically player characters can in fact make a difference in a world where sometimes you're talking about this sometimes it doesn't feel like you can, and so it's great to be like, okay, no, everyone basically can make a difference, and basically these people here's how these people are making a difference, and basically it's a little bit of escapism at the same time. It's a hey, sometimes basically you have to step up and you have to take a stand and you have to basically do something to make a difference because you're there and you understand what's going on, and because of that you have to act, and sometimes it's because you've been granted superpowers to do that, like in this case, and then basically you get those cool stuff, and sometimes it's just because of the fact that you realize wait, I understand what's going on in the world. You've been given that gift of clarity of understanding, and that means that you need to basically take a step forward and basically make a stand and make a difference in the world. And so it's great to do that. And basically, Paragon basically is a superhero system. Basically, it's basically this basically all the store stuff is in the chat. The quick start guide is available there. Basically, the book is out, and basically the starter kit, which is a great way of being able to basically get your group kind of quickly and easily into the game, will be coming out soon via Kickstarter, basically later this year. And so basically we've talked a lot about basically cool influences, basically your media basically in terms of basically superhero cartoons, whether they are Western or basically Japanese in terms of basically the animated My Hero Academia, basically Teen Titans are both great systems where they're not just basically superhero A beats up superhero B. There's consequences, there's real life, there's people, basically there's powers changing and growing and things like that. And we talked about X-Men in terms of reflecting the real world, in terms of hey, basically how does the superhero world tell a story that basically reflects what's going on in the real world, and how can a role playing system kind of reflect that. So we talked a lot about those cool things. There's anything that I've left out basically that you want to be like, hey, basically I've got this really cool, basically we've got this cool system, we've got this cool mechanic, basically in terms of, or do you basically not basically just basically leave us with the quick pitch on what makes Paragons interesting and why people should check it out?
Yeah, I think we have pretty comprehensively talked about everything that I normally like to talk about when I talk about Paragons. And I feel like it's not possible to cover so much ground, and I think we've done a phenomenal job of hitting all the highlights. Um, I, my big pitch is it is a game that lets you feel like a hero. It's fun. The rules are like fun to engage with. It feels good to play. And then beyond that, I think it is helpful to have stories about heroes that we can look to in times when we're going through challenges and facing adversity ourselves. To have a hero that we can admire, someone to view as a role model and try to follow in their footsteps. I think different stages of my life, I've gravitated towards certain different heroes based off of the things that I felt like I needed in that moment. There have been times where I've really, felt inspired by Captain America and his bravery and the ideals that he stands up for. There have been times where I've, really felt inspired by vigilante heroes like Spider-Man, who step up and save the day, not because they have like the luxury of it, but because they have the responsibility and they need to be the ones to do it. There isn't a choice for them. It is simply the right thing to do, and so they have to step up. And so having these role models, these characters that we gravitate towards, that we look up to, that inspire us, I think is really important. The stories that we tell one another are a reflection of our values, I think. And so it's great to have hero stories that inspire us to be better versions of ourselves. That's what I'll leave it at.
So that is basically a great message basically for basically why role-playing games are what they are, why they are even more necessary in these times where that seems darker. Basically what they can teach us, what they can give us, what hope they can give us, and what stories what the power of stories is, and basically what type of storytellers people need at certain times. And so basically, thank you so much for having on here, for sharing Paragons with us and talking about talking about these cool superheroes and things like that. And basically, as always, basically talking about storytellers and the importance of that, I will kind of wrap it up by talking about basically who we are. Basically myself and basically the rest of my team are LoreLink, and we're basically dedicating to help tell those stories, whether it is by highlighting cool systems that you can check out that basically give you the building blocks to build those stories, or by our digital toolkit, which is LoreLink, which allows you to basically have a place to create those worlds and build out those stories and spend more time doing what you want to do, which is telling the stories with your players, basically having those cool moments, getting those epic moments where we get to to use the Captain America metaphor, to punch Hitler in the face. It's going to give your players that awesome moment. Superman taking down the organized gangsters. Basically their intros. That's the root of these superhero stories. And basically being able to tell them and basically keep track of them and be able to do them in a way that lets you and your players tell them and build them up and keep going and not have to stop and reset and check your notes and find stuff. So basically, obviously, if you want to learn more about LoreLink, you can check it out on lorelink.com. Basically, we've got all the information, basically how you can use LoreLink, what levels, what the various cool tools and features of LoreLink we have there. And of course, if you want to learn more about cool systems and things like that, it's what we do here. We like using our Twitch channel to do. So you can find out about more cool creators like Joshua here. And basically next week we will be back with a different cool creator. We'll be talking with basically the creator of Gravity and Myriad Inverse. So that is next week. And obviously, of course, if you want to support basically our channel here, throwing follows at the channel is a great way of just being like, hey, I want to find out when they're doing stuff. You can find out what cool people we're talking to next. So you can use the follow to do that. Obviously, there's a subscribe button, and we will never stop you from clicking that button. We appreciate it. But we're never going to lock anything behind a paywall. That's not how we work here. Basically, if you want to use Amazon to take a little bit of Jeff Bezos's evil yacht money. Basically where he's building his supervillain yacht and take it from them and give it to us, where we promise we will never use it to buy a supervillain yacht. We might buy an in-game yacht, but that's about it. So you can always Amazon Prime Gaming is always great for doing that. It's always appreciated, never expected. And if you want to catch the recap for that, listen to we did, or see some of the other cool creators we talked to, whether this month or in the previous year, you can check out our YouTube channel. That is where all these streams are archived, where all the videos are, and basically guides on how to use the LoreLink, and all of that is available over there. And of course, if you're interacting with YouTube, clicking like, commenting are great ways of just being like, oh, hey, cool, I want to support you and help us defeat the evil algorithm, which basically seems to rule more and more of our lives, this giant AI present bearing down on us. But basically all of that to say, thank you all so much for watching and for listening. And we will come back and catch us here next week, where we do more cool stuff. So thank you all again. And check us, keep up with us. I forgot Blue Sky and Newsletter are also out there. They're also great ways of finding it out. I would be remiss if I didn't talk about those. Great members of our team support those as well. So thanks for stopping by, and we will catch you all later.